Good afternoon to everyone in the room and to the millions watching online at this very moment. And welcome to this side event here from the European Pavilion at COP26 in Glasgow, where we shall be looking at human mobility in times of climate change, from science to policy and action. As you know, climate change appears today as a leading driver of migration and displacement across the world. We know what are the regions most affected. We also know that the migration flows induced by climate change can be of very different patterns, can be of very different nature, and that therefore, when we discuss how can science translate into policy and action, we know that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that the policy interventions that will need to be deployed on site will be very often context-specific, and that depending on the situation, depending on the type of impacts of climate change, but also depending on the type of migration flow, we will need to deploy different policy tools and different solutions. And this is what we shall be addressing in this panel today. We'll have a wide range of speakers from both the policy-making world, but also from science and research, from also different corners of the world that should help us address the variety of situations and therefore the diversity of policy interventions that are needed. Here at COP26, clearly this issue of human mobility is addressed both in terms of adaptation as a potential solution and strategy for adaptation, but is also addressed in terms of loss and damage, considering the trauma and the cost of people being uprooted. And obviously, both these negotiation channels address different types of migration and displacement, but we should also consider that policy solutions are also discussed outside of these climate negotiations, that discussions on the Global Compact for migration are also important, discussions on disaster risk reduction are also important, and I think that I'm hoping that this side event will also provide an opportunity to think a bit outside of the box about how we can organize migration better, especially at times where in most countries, at least in Europe, migration policies are becoming increasingly difficult to discuss. And we know that migration and asylum is a subject of tension and division within the European Union, and I'm really hoping that we can discuss proactive solutions in this side event. So, without further ado, I would like to yield the floor now to the first speaker, Dr. Kira Vink. Kira used to work for the Potsdam Institute for research on the impacts of climate change, and this is how we got to know each other, and she now heads the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the GMT. She's still an affiliated scientist with SPEAK. Kira, you also co-chair the advisory board to the German federal government on civilian crisis prevention and peace building, and your research focuses on climate change and migration, and you've conducted field research in different countries, especially in South Asia, the Pacific, and the Sahel. So the floor is yours, Kira, for about 9 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Francois, and thank you also for connecting the dots between the process of negotiations here at COP with the other policy-making processes around climate change and migration and displacement. Very happy to be here on this panel today. And I want to give you two examples from our work over the past years where we did research in different country contexts on the interactions between climate and migration, and also how we linked this to policy-making procedures. So one is Peru, where we published a report on the interlinkages between different climate impacts on agriculture, on hydrology, and their effects on people living in the Andes region, living on the coast, living in the rainforest. And what we found out is that the further you look into the future, even under a 2-degree scenario, which is, as we know here, not a scenario that we can rely on because the mitigation plans that have been laid out are not sufficient to hold this warming line. Even in such a low emissions scenario, we see devastating impacts in Peru. We see that we will probably have unprecedented glacial retreat, of which we are already witnessing parts today. We also see that this affects freshwater availability in the short term. It also means that you will have glacial lake bursts displacing communities, especially in the high Andes. And as we look further into the future, we see compounding effects. So we see also that, for example, the El Niño system is starting to change. We are seeing more extreme El Niño events. And this again translates into significant losses of livelihoods. So we compounded assessing the evidence report, which assesses all the scientific evidence that has been created over the past decade or two, both on the natural science side as well as on the migration side. And then we come out with policy recommendations on how to protect people from climate change impacts, but also to help people to move if they move. And this includes, for example, trainings to people who are displaced and who have to migrate, for example, to urban city centers, so that they, who are often basically farmers or fishermen, can also receive skills to be able to work in cities and live a dignified life. So in this case, of Peru, we are also holding discussions with the Peruvian ministries. For example, the Ministry of Environment, we are in close discussion with CENAMI, the hydrometeorological service in Peru, and we are advising my colleague Jonas Bergmann, who is not here today, who is writing his PhD on this topic, is advising also the government of Peru on the National Adaptation Plan, so that the knowledge that we create in the scientific field is also translated into this. And also we have Peruvian hydrologists working at the Potsdam Institute who contributed to this report. The second example I want to give you is on Burkina Faso today, where we did field research, qualitative field research, before the violence erupted in Burkina Faso on the border region to Mali. And here we interviewed both men and women who, because of drought conditions, migrated seasonally and returned to their village. And what we found out is that both men and women viewed the migration as a very negative experience. The outcomes of this migration were not positive for them. Why? Because they were not able to stabilize their livelihoods through the migration. Basically, they were exploited. Money was taken away from them, and also it really affected their family lives because they were separated over time as the men migrated and the women stayed behind. But also we found out, as we interviewed men and women separately, that they viewed migration outcomes differently. They both viewed them negatively in this case, but they gave different reasons as to why. For the women, it was the extra burden of having to do childcare alone, having to tend to agricultural land alone while the men were gone, so they were double burdened. For the men, it was the absence from home and the very, very strenuous conditions in the places where they, for example, cut sugarcane or worked in gold mines. So this means that migration is not always a success story. It can also lead to a deterioration of socioeconomic basis of families. So we have to look at how we can help people to establish themselves when they migrate seasonally or when they migrate permanently, so they are able to live successful lives and able to offset the losses that they're experiencing from climate change impacts. And this research is now also being communicated back to the village where we worked in. However, as you all know, the security situation in Burkina Faso deteriorated significantly. There are some small changes, so there's also the challenge of how to feed back science into policymaking, into action. And there are some small changes that we have made through this. For example, we have now changed the way that data collection is done. So, for example, migration is there and defined as a migration of 6 months. And now it's reduced to 3 months, so that we can actually capture in our data collection efforts the migration period that is below 6 months. So this is one point. And the other point is that it has to be communicated to the communal level how livelihoods can be strengthened during migration, but also after people return from seasonal migration. I'll stop here so that we have some time to discuss our various perspectives. And over to you, François.
Thank you very much, Kira. Our second speaker is Julia Blocher. And Julia, you will speak in a dual capacity, if I may say, given that you're at the same time a researcher at PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research, but also you're the president of the International Youth Federation, which is a co-organizer of this event today, which is an international non-profit youth empowerment organizations network. And in your presentation, you will address climate change and migration as two development issues that cannot really be addressed without each other. So you will have a 5-minute slot to speak, and then your speech will be followed by a short video from the International Youth Federation.
Is this working? Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Kira, for coming in at the minute there. Thanks, Francois, for the introduction. I'm also very happy to be here to present some of my research from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research, and also as a president of the International Youth Federation to be co-organizing this panel. The title of the event today is From Science to Policy to Action. And I think that we sometimes think of these things as feeding into each other, but I wanted to start out by saying that this is not, it should not be a unilateral direction. In fact, these things need to inform each other. It's, in my opinion, really important that science addresses issues that come from society and people who are having lived experiences, especially people on the ground having local experiences. And it's also very important that scientists and policymakers listen to people at national and subnational levels when addressing issues such as climate change and migration. So as you previewed already, Francois, my main message today really is that climate change and migration both are issues, development issues that cannot be addressed without including youth in all three of these points, in the science, in the policy, and in the action. The definition that we use of youth is very often an age range of 18 to 24, and in some cases up to 35, which I think means that everyone's on this panel is a young person, right? But the concept of youth, if we think about it, is really that it's an age in between adolescence and adulthood. And if we think about it that way, we can begin to understand better why migration and youth are almost synonymous, that people moving between an educational phase to a career phase, migration can sometimes accompany this transition, or moving from singledom to marriage. In some cases, migration may also accompany this. And unfortunately, climate change exposes and also exacerbates inequalities that makes it more difficult for migration to happen in a way that is positive for young people and also really climate-affected people in general. Some people simply cannot afford the social and financial costs of migration, and as for some of those who can, climate change makes it harder for them to migrate in ways that improve their situation. As Kira mentioned, in some cases it can be erosive to their household resources and coping capacities. And in my research, I've heard from young people from climate-affected communities around the world that in their origin areas are facing, for example, young people are facing the burden of unpaid care, which is heightened, of course, for women and girls, and which we saw also during the COVID crisis was increased. Young people are losing educational opportunities or career development opportunities because of lack of access to these, and also because of the so-called digital divide, which was also exacerbated during COVID. And some people simply have seen their household resources eroded because of climate impacts, especially in agricultural communities, or people who rely on natural resources for their income sources. So this has promoted some people to migrate in ways that they may not have wanted to, especially for wage labor, and in other cases is leading some families to decide to invite their young girls to get married earlier than they would have otherwise wanted to. And this, of course, is especially an issue for young women and girls in the global south, if I can use that term. And then finally, when migrants, young people arrived in their destination areas, they've reported in our research as well that they face heightened anti-migrant discrimination, in part because of their lower status as youth. They're also very often forced into informal or low-paid working conditions, unsafe working conditions. In other cases, also, this is accompanied by informal and unsafe housing situations and may be vulnerable to evictions and violence in this case. And of course, for women and girls, they have a disproportionate risk of gender-based violence. And the common denominator in all of these points, which we heard from young people, is that they have lower coping capacities in general than their elders. They have lower status in the community and in their own homes. They face age discrimination and also have low representation. So the same inequalities that we saw exposed by the COVID crisis are the same that make it that people experience climate change in different ways, and young people are experiencing disproportionate impacts. As some of us in the room are aware, the climate change migration research field that informs the policies that we've been discussing in the past years and during this COP, the state of the art is that migration is a part of household livelihood strategies to diversify income sources and reduce risks to the household. So the thinking being that if we improve community and household resources, people can migrate in dignity or migrate better. But I think that it's important to nuance this a little bit further and recognize that this blindness to the dynamics and inequalities within communities and also within households contributes to this disconnect between the lived experiences of people affected by climate change and the current policies that are not necessarily really helping people in the ways that they need to. So I think in research as well as in policy, we need to look at power dynamics to understand better who is able to migrate and who is benefiting from migration in the context of climate change, and how can we help everyone to experience this in a way that will be helpful to them and not leave people behind, quite literally, and migration being something that can be beneficial to all. I wanted to take as an example some research that we did recently for a project that Kira already mentioned. We conducted a quantitative analysis of people migrating in Tanzania as a result of different types of household shocks. And what we found is that if you look at a longer-term perspective and look at different types of shocks over time, we have a stronger connection between facing shocks and migration than if we look in one point in time or one type of shock at a time, which up until now has been mostly the research that exists. So it's evidence that this situation of facing repeated impacts and repeated hits to household resources over time erodes people's ability to cope in the case of climate change shocks, and people become more likely to migrate over time as a result. We're really very much hoping to continue this research into a new project which is called Habitable, in which we will look at what point do we face a situation that a community becomes less livable as a result of these repeated and frequent shocks that erodes household resources. We were able to substantiate some of this research with recent qualitative research in dryland East Africa, finding that household resources are generally managed by the household head, which in a lot of communities in East Africa is, of course, the father, and then eventually passed down to the oldest brother. And when these households are faced with repeated shocks and livestock loss, they change their strategies. For example, as I mentioned before, choosing to marry young girls earlier than they would have otherwise, and they have unfortunately limited agency in this. So this being said, it's, I think, very important that we remember that we have to look not just at the community level, but also within the households, and remember all of the communities involved in the migration experience. So coming now to these specific policy solutions that I would offer to the panel, I do think it's very important that we have genuine and meaningful participation of youth in the research that we conduct, in the policy discussions. And then, frankly, they're already involved in the action part and the implementation part. So even if we have some progress on these points, youth are still edged out of the most important, highest discussions on these topics. And this is an unfortunate situation, because we know that when we include different perspectives and lived experiences into policy discussions, we get better outcomes. Meaningful participation helps people who are ultimately part of the implementation process to have ownership in this, and involve other stakeholders to make meaningful solutions. And secondly, also for youth, they're offering practical solutions. I think we'll hear some later in the panel that are cost-effective, scalable, and very workable solutions. Young people are leading NGOs for migrant integration, for example, developing new technologies for biometric identification, for communications, etc. Youth are really critical to practical local solutions to this question. So that being said, I wanted to now introduce a video that will be looking at some of this grassroots action by youth that was produced by the International Youth Federation. We wanted to bring as many voices of young people as possible to this COP because, of course, we know not everyone was able to attend or attend in person. So we put out a call to action to our members, of which we have 170 accredited organizations across 5 continents. And we'll hear some of their experiences in this video. And I wanted to mention that we furthermore participated in recent months in the Global Youth Inquiry, which was launched at the Extreme Youth Hangout this week by One Young World and Mishkan Derea. So if we could play the video, thank you very much.
Do you see the world a better place by 2030?
The International Youth Federation works in line with the values of the global youth movement to foster effective knowledge sharing, convening, collaborating, peer-to-peer support systems, and leadership training. Youth around the world are already leading and generating solutions to today's key challenges. They're starting student groups, founding NGOs, and creating innovations in the private sector. IYF wants to provide the tools, networks, and support systems to help young people excel in the work that they're already doing. IYF wants to unleash the potential of youth by galvanizing and empowering young leaders in efforts towards sustainable, inclusive development. The International Youth Federation is a global youth network, an organization advocating for youth empowerment and connecting countries to knowledge, experience, and resources to help young people build a better future.
As the climate is changing, environmental stress is rising and becoming one of the reasons for migration. All around the globe, households are experiencing the impacts of natural hazards such as floods, fire, and hurricanes. In some cases, migration can be a survival approach, but such displacements represent a form of forced migration and can lead populations, including youth, to cross borders and confront social and other protection gaps. It is the youth who have to be at the forefront of the needed transformations. We surely have the most to gain and ultimately the most to lose if together we cannot create the conditions for a future that is more forgiving and generous rather than exploitative of both humans and the environment.
Hi, young people from all over the world. We, the young people, are the biggest and better prepared generation of humans the world has ever seen. It also seems that we will become the generation of people who will live the longest. And we're also going to be the ones who inherit the earth, our home. A planet that already struggles with the faults committed by the generations previous to ours. And we are also going to be the ones who suffer the consequences. So what are we doing to help our struggling world? Polluting it with plastic waste and greenhouse gases? Depleting our soils and oceans? Not only we're being ungrateful with the home that has allowed us to exist and thrive, we're also being ungrateful with our kids and the kids of our kids, to who will hand even a worse socioeconomic and environmental catastrophes than the ones we face now. Unless we do something about it. For that reason, I urge you to become leaders who adopt and promote the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and encourage and empower other people to become ambassadors of the same cause. If we don't care for our own home now, then who and when? Truth can be denied, but not avoided. To save the earth is to save us.
I strongly believe that youth empowerment is one of the greatest assets to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe this because we as young people are the next generation of leaders, we are the next generation of teachers, we are the next generations of doctors, and we are definitely the next generation of politicians.
I grew up in the lush forests of Northern Europe and now I live by the sea. So I've always been in close contact with nature. Nature has incredible therapeutic properties, which is particularly important for young people facing so much economic and societal pressure nowadays. But I'm also aware that deforestation and overfishing are threatening these ecosystems today more than ever before. That's why I'm urging everyone to act upon Sustainable Development Goal 13 and take climate action. Today is we're finally coming to realization that climate catastrophe is closer than we thought. It's crucially important to act, campaign for change, and protect what is so dear to us, our nature.
In a world urgently needing structural changes, youth cannot remain in silence. Injustice, inequalities, and other issues have tarnished all social contexts. However, this reality shall not determine our story or guide our actions. We are agents of change, not tomorrow, but today.
Thank you very much, Julia, for both your talk and the video as well. I would like now to turn to Mr. Hamad Yazan Miri. Yazan, you're a Syrian environmental activist and you work with an international young community of scientists and activists in Youth for Nature, which aims to be a bridge for all the young voices, indigenous people and marginalized communities around the globe. And here at COP26, you are seeking to advance the rights of refugees and migrants and to make their voices heard. So please, Yazan, the floor is now yours for about 5 minutes. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. First of all, I'm so glad to be here with all of you. Without the background noise of clashes and bombs that I used to experience in the Zoom calls. First of all, I had 11 years of experience from the one of the worst wars in the world in this century. I'm climate activist and environmental activist from Syria, and I'm here to deliver the voices that I heard from my visit of immigrant camps the last month before I came here to COP. I will start with a quote that I took from them. We are still asking for the very basics of justice. We are asking for a movement that doesn't exclude us. We are asking for a free space we can co-lead this movement from. This movement for safety, for humanity, rights and nature and climate, for our future. Today, as we are discussing science and politics, we should also discuss and include those voices from the underground experience perspective. We can't ignore them because they are a crucial part of the solutions. They have the nature, which is the most powerful solution that we can use to tackle climate change. Why nature? Because without the access of the internet or any other technologies, residents of the camp that I visit have no remaining resource to adapt to poverty and the climate crisis. And one result that they had been having for thousands and thousands of years in these countries, which is nature. As a former internal displaced person, I can share with you some of my experience during the war in my country. Living 6 months without electricity supply, I can understand and fully understand what the lack of resources means. Going in a daily based traveling to the wells to try to find a water supply for my family. Those experiences are really makes us understanding what's the future of the climate migration. We can understand what's the feelings, how we can co-lead on the solutions from this perspective, from the underground pain, suffer, and faith was always leading and inspiring me and guide me to to think about a solution that can not just solve our problems in the war affected areas, not just that, but we are aiming to solve others' problems and avoid it before trying to solve it. In the past 2 weeks, I was disappointing actually because I didn't saw any delegation for climate refugees. It was really inspiring that I saw the Little Amal journey arriving to Glasgow, but we don't need more symbols here. We need the real Amal, the real little girl that I met in Syria 1 month ago to be here to deliver her voices and needs. We need to talk more and co-lead on the solutions and share the discussion with you in all our UN summits, the next UN summits. We need to be here. We need our voices to be heard. Our problems and challenges to be heard from our perspective, because we know and exactly know how the future is coming for climate refugees. Also, we are delivering solutions from the on the ground level. We are not just numbers from the scientific labs. No, we are also sharing new solutions like mine when I was organizing the first ever community composting program in my city, and when I see women in the camps are trying to use nature-based solutions like to avoid the consequences of climate change. For example, I saw a lot of women there trying to build animals' places in a natural and traditional ways, without any air conditioning, without any controlling, electricity controlling. And also I saw that they are farming seasonal and local crops to use around their tents, even during a very challenging times that they are being in. We are having in the next the next speaker will be also immigrants living in Europe, but I want to highlight that we need to be here. We need to be heard as an internal displaced person, as a people from on the ground. We don't need to be more numbers in the labs. We need to share our experience, our emotions, and our solutions to co-lead this movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yazan. It was extraordinary and moving to hear your insights about what environmental activism looks like in a country at war. Our fourth speaker is also from Syria. He is now a refugee living in Berlin, and he will address us through a video conference. So, Mr. Firas Khalife, you have founded and you're the CEO of Carbon Mobile, which is a company created to advance the sustainable future of connected devices. And the company aims to become the Tesla of consumer electronics. So we will hear also what kind of technological innovation can be made, especially, I imagine, in challenging circumstances when you have been yourself a refugee from a country at war. So, Mr. Firas Khalife, thanks a lot for being with us from Berlin, and the floor is yours for about 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the speaker. I wish I can be there physically. Unfortunately, I couldn't get visa on time due to my background, actually. My name is Firas. I'm a computer engineer, product engineer, and serial entrepreneur originally from Syria. I actually came to Europe as the European Center of Innovation, especially to Germany, being a refugee. I came with a vision to end e-waste and address climate changes that caused by one specific industry, which is the consumer electronics. I started Carbon Mobile as a company to address what's the e-waste issue is causing today. It's causing over 50 million tons of e-waste being generated every year. Over 80% of that end up in the landfills. We created Carbon Mobile to be the leading the adoption of sustainable high-tech materials in personal electronics to make products really thinner, lighter, stronger, and more sustainable. I created Carbon Mobile to revolutionize the consumer electronics market by tackling the problem of e-waste, halting plastics, enabling sustainable circular economy through advanced materials and technologies. And yes, it's really our vision to be the Tesla of personal electronics. Our technology today doesn't only allow electronics for our products, which we created and we launched early this year after 5 years and a half of research. We created a technology called hydrocom technology and addressing a market of over $1.3 trillion. But also this technology, it addresses the whole market as a whole. Our ambition is that this technology will be ready for the mass market, where other brands, we see them contacting us and asking us, how do we use this technology that we have today? Our product has already reached multiple awards with a lot of press worldwide around it. I'm very proud of this achievement today that we have, but also what I'm mostly proud is that what we are tackling toward e-waste. We are the first product that has the least amount of plastic ever in a smartphone. We built a smartphone called Carbon One Mark II. We launched it early this year. It has the least amount of plastics, and it has advanced materials like recycled composites and bio-based plastics in the future as well. And we are tackling fair trade businesses and also made in Germany product and simpler to assembly. We have brought assembly back to Germany after 17 years being dominated by Asia. We have ambition to decentralize globalization and try to address more greener energy solutions. I'm very glad and happy that I managed to also attract teams who worked for some of the big brands like Apple, Nokia, and HTC, OnePlus, and other companies to work with us. And we still have the ambition to be, as a Tesla of personal electronics, we have the ambition to build continuously other products and that goes into our daily life, from a smartphone to tablet, earphone, smart glasses, AR and VR. What I want to address actually also personally is that this project has caused me a lot of struggle, all the way from the starting point, especially when I arrived to Germany. It's not particularly, maybe the system is welcoming for immigrants and refugees. And I had a very, very tough journey. And the first 8 months when I arrived here, I have to run the company from a refugee camp, actually, at the very beginning. The system didn't help me to understand that I have a company and I have a vision that I want to address. And actually today we brought a lot of investment into the company after 5 years, and we have people who are working for the company from Europe, USA, and China. What I want to say is that entrepreneurs in Europe today are 21% of them are immigrants, and in Germany in particular, 44% are immigrants. And that's according to Atomico Venture reports today. We can see that also from the European Commission plans on the 2021-2027, that they say that there is no dedicated funds that helps immigrants. And there's some venture capitals and others who are trying to tackle this. But simply, we can see that entrepreneurs, as the European Commission says, immigrants, entrepreneurs contribute to growth, create jobs, and can contribute to a post-COVID period. However, they face multiple challenges, such as lack of network, difficulties accessing credit, insufficient knowledge of the regularity and financial framework. And that's definitely most of the issues I've been facing for the last 5 years. I wish that this is, I think with immigrants, today, we should see them not as a problem, not as something that we would like to address them and how to handle them, but more of a solution. We are really a solution here. We don't want to cause problems to anybody. Actually, when we came here, we have nothing to lose. And when you have nothing to lose, you have everything to gain, actually. And that's what we can do. We can take much more bigger risk, and we can seek opportunities in a bit more innovative way. And that's what led us to Carbon Mobile, the company that I have today. So I would appreciate if we can address those policies that can help that. And of course, the next wave of migrants and refugees will be climate refugees. So we should address that as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Firas. And it was great to have you online, even though you couldn't make it here, unfortunately. Our fifth speaker is Mr. Nakanyeli Spade. Nakanyeli, you're a specialist of the Pacific, and you focus there on climate change and disaster-induced displacement. You used to work for UNDP, and now you engage with communities and you explore with them how to integrate climate change and disaster risk reduction into development decision-making.
Is something that we have already experienced
Recording
through the
in
Pacific
progress.
response for disaster displacement. And we've have accomplished the integration of disaster displacement consideration into the Tonga National Emergency Act. We have informed the policy dialogue on the internal Pacific Regional Internal Displacement Dialogue that was conducted and convened through the technical working group on human mobility through the support as well of the UNSG high-level panel on internal displacement. And there are a series of national consultations and regional consultations where we had partnered with to ensure that the voices of the internally displaced people in the context of climate change and disaster displacement are considered and prioritized and seriously and intentionally addressed in all the policy, but also the action framework at regional, local, national, and also at local level. Now, how did we do this? And what's important in all this integration work? The first thing is the need for risk information. Not only that, but the need to also socialize this risk information. Now, some of our findings, we've profiled 4 countries that we currently work with in this particular project through the support, the kind of support of the European Union. And we are finding out that in the Pacific, there's about 832,000 new displacement that has happened in the past decade. And this is quite unprecedented. And tropical cyclones and flooding triggered most of this displacement. Now, the figures are not in the millions, but when you look at the disproportional impact of displacement, this is quite a serious number. In 2020 alone, Vanuatu was affected by the tropical cyclone Harold, and 80,000 new displacement happened in 2020 alone for Vanuatu. That is 27% of the entire population of Vanuatu. Fiji, during the tropical cyclone Yasa, the entire community of Nambavatu and Dongea in the island of Vanuatu have been completely displaced, and they're still in displacement situation at the moment, awaiting a decision on being relocated. So you can imagine in this pandemic, the situation at the moment with these 2 communities. Now, displacement, a lot of time we only think about emergency events, but small events are triggering a lot of forced movement in most of the Pacific Island countries. Heavy rainfalls, flooding happens, people are moving, and that is still right now not recognized. So this risk information is quite important, and the challenges are also still there. And one of the key challenges, a lot of the policy that has been established in the Pacific to address this issue of disaster displacement are still based on historical data and information. We now need to move into ensuring that projections are part of this consideration. We need to look into the future and to anticipate the risks that's up ahead so that we can be more targeted in the way we address the needs of our displaced population in the Pacific. The second thing is the centralization of data. That is another important thing that we need to ensure that is established as a building block to a more effective integration process that's going to happen. And this is a huge need in the Pacific. One project alone cannot achieve this, and it is a huge gap in the Pacific. Data are sitting in very different organizations, different level of governance. At local level, it's a separate one, and it's not harmonized. And this is where we are calling on partnerships. We are calling on harmonizations of systems to ensure that this support is provided to small island developing states in the Pacific. And the need for socialization. We need to be intentional about this. It's good to have sound data, it's good to have science, but then it can be just on paper. We need to be intentional about socializing this evidence. We need to know what is the channel of diffusing this knowledge, diffusing this science at local level, at national level, and also at the regional level. For us, we are fortunate to be partnering with organizations such as the Platform for Disaster Displacement and also the international organization. We optimize on our network and our contact to ensure that we are using the different channels to diffuse information to inform all the global, regional, and national policy processes. And then leadership is also quite important in the integration process. We need to understand the political economy. Who is supporting this, the need to address this disaster displacement issue, and being able to maximize on the people that are already supporting it and working with them in order to ensure that this serious issue is anchored, it has a home. And there's already a financial support, there's already political support that is there to ensure that it results into tangible action and it responds to the need of internally displaced people. Second building block to ensuring effective policy integration is capacity. Now, in the region, we have undertaken 11 community vulnerability assessment and training through the support, through the International Organization for Migration. What we are finding out is the fact that a lot of these systems are sitting outside. When you talk about evidence, all these systems are sitting outside of government. We need to ensure that we are working within government systems. And that is one of the intention of the project, is ensuring that we are strengthening the internal system of government. We are working with local government to make sure that their system is strengthened. And it's no point having to set up separate system to monitor disaster displacement, but also to implement policies and actions. We need to be working with existing government system. We also recognize the role of local government. In this project, we're finding out that the hotspot for disaster displacement is now more and more in urban centers. And the role of municipalities, the role of town council are very critical, not only in acting, but also in monitoring and informing the work of National Disaster Management Offices and Climate Change Division, so that necessary support flows down into communities at local level who are vulnerable, who are already experiencing the risks and impact of internal displacement. Partnerships. And this is a critical building block for any effective policy integration. We need to be working with one another, whether you're a young person or whether you're academic, whether you're NGO, private sector, whether you're at regional, global, or even national level. We are all here. We are all needed in this movement to be able to address the need of our internally displaced people in our different countries. And principally, the foundation of having to support and address the risks and impacts of the displacement is we need a lot more listening. We need to be listening more to the needs of people. We need to be listening more to those who are acting on the ground. And we are here at a global level. And I think it's very important that we listen to one another. Negotiation is happening on the other side of the room. I think this is a time where we really need to listen in order to be targeted in the way we act towards addressing the needs of our internally displaced people. I'll end there, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naka. And before we hopefully have time for a few questions, I would now like to give the floor to Mrs. Thea Tira from the Republic of Kiribati. You've worked in governmental positions for over a decade, for the IMF and the World Bank as well. You are now with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, where you coordinate the Pacific adaptation to climate change and resilience building projects. So the floor is yours for about 3 minutes, and please try and be short so that we have time for questions.
Thank you, moderator. I'll try and be very brief. So from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and as Natha has earlier advocated on, the issue of human mobility, and particularly in the region, is quite sensitive, but also very complex. We were discussing, earlier on, the moderator highlighted that negotiations are happening around adaptation, loss and damage. Loss and damage for the Pacific is not just a phrase. It's a matter of survival for us. It's our livelihood. It's our sovereignty that is being put under question. And in this context, it's for us, why should our people be moving? Why should our people be abandoning their ways of life, their communities, their islands, because of the impacts of climate change? And it is in this context, understanding the sensitivities, and I think Nada also highlighted this very important point. You really have to listen to the people to understand how you mitigate, but also assist them in when they're being impacted by climate change and disasters. And in the context of the Pacific, a joint working group has been established, and this has been established under the leadership of Fiji and Tuvalu. I don't know if you saw one of the side events that the EU also, IOM organized, and our minister from Tuvalu was speaking with after a while the camera then focused, and he was standing in the middle of the ocean. That is, it's more like it's not about just words. I think a lot of people need to really see the reality that is happening in the Pacific. And in this context, we're trying to develop a regional framework, and this is being done with under the Pacific Climate Change, Migration and Human Security Program. And this program is a partnership with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. It's being led by the IOM, but it's also led by partners, ISCAP, ILO, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also our partners, the Platform for Disaster Displacement, because it does need a lot of collaboration. As highlighted by my fellow panelists, this issue is not an easy one. A lot of the people that are impacted, but also we have to also remember the host communities. They are also being impacted by people moving, by people mobilizing. And as I said earlier, for the region, they're quite adamant that this should not be an option at all, moving from their communities, their islands, abandoning their ways of life. So the joint working group that has been established is looking into setting up a regional framework. And this regional framework is part of the suite of tools that our people have, the Pacific have. And part of it is also ensuring, as Natha highlighted earlier, what you need also is political will. Because when you have political will, there is then that strong foundation for practical and real action to happen. And not only that, it really needs a lot of collaborative effort between partners. And as Natha highlighted as well, the region has set up the Pacific Resilience Partnership, which is bringing together all stakeholders, not just governments, because this conversation is not just with government alone, also with civil society. And as our other panelists have highlighted, it's also about the young people, because you're talking about their future as well. Not only their future, but also they are very active members of society. So they need to be part of that conversation and part of looking into what are the solutions that can support our people. So the regional framework is currently under development, and it's being also led by our member countries, because you really need to have the support of the member countries, but also understanding that mobility is a very localized issue. So you can't, looking at it from a regional perspective, you understand that there are courses that are common across the board, across countries, but the impacts are quite different. They vary because in the region, I come from Kiribati, which is an atoll nation. And when you talk about relocation for an atoll nation, there's really no option at all. It's not an option. So in that context, from our perspective, from a regional perspective, we have to support our people to be able to make choices, to have the options of what they can do. And as I said earlier, climate change and the discussions that are happening here, there should be a connection, not just about connecting adaptation and loss and damage, but connecting to the people that are being impacted. And thank you for that, moderator.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just asking, do we have time for a couple of questions before I give the floor to... So let me give the floor immediately to Mr. Terry Atalifo, who's the acting director of Fiji Meteorological Service and is representing the government of Fiji in this function. Thanks for being with us.
Yes, thank you, moderator. In Fiji, we greet people by saying Bula Vinaka. So I'd like to say Bula Vinaka to all of you, and including our colleagues who are joining us from the virtual platform. I'm speaking today representing the government of Fiji, including in its capacity to, as the chair of the platform on disaster displacement, PDD in short. So the PDD is a state-led initiative working towards better protection of persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. I congratulate the organizers and the panelists for this side event. I really enjoyed hearing your inputs, and for that we are very thankful. Thank you for sharing the latest research findings, the evidence and practice of human mobility and climate change. I was particularly pleased to see how these are being integrated into policy frameworks, and to hear from affected communities, including from our youth representatives. Thanks to the interventions of my colleagues, and we know the important work and effective practices being developed in the Pacific region. But this side event has also succeeded in bringing together evidence and practices from multiple regions around the globe and communities of practice, fostering a rich exchange of learning opportunity. Being reminded about where we are, the 26th COP of the UNFCCC, it is very important to highlight that everything that we have heard today, including the research, evidence, practices, and the voices of those who are affected, in particular the youth, suggests that we have much work ahead of us in terms of developing effective responses to the needs and challenges of human mobility in the context of adverse effects of our changing climate. Firstly, we need to continue and determined action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate the impacts of climate change in order to reduce displacement risks. Secondly, we need to strengthen our efforts to help people to stay where possible and help them to move when necessary or desired. This means scaling up adaptation and disaster risk reduction commitments and measures. Thirdly, we need to improve efforts to address the protection and assistance needs of persons, whether displaced within the countries or across borders. This also means committing to addressing loss and damage related to the adverse effects of our changing climate. The Fijian government has long recognized the threat climate change and disasters pose to its territory, and as such, it has undertaken significant work to develop responsive laws and policies at the national level. For example, as part of our efforts to implement national measures that support our communities to adapt to climate change, prepare for its consequences, and address loss and damage, Fiji has developed national plan relocation guidelines and disaster displacement guidelines. They set out important principles in assisting communities affected by displacement, and they offer practical guidance, for example, on plan relocations. It is clear that climate change affects regions differently, but we have an opportunity to learn from each other. And I like the way we put it across from my colleague from Fiji, we need to listen more. And I encourage and further exchange our effective practices across regions, such as we have seen today. I once again congratulate the organizers of the events, the panelists, and of course, our excellent moderator for presenting us with diverse perspectives and experiences. We would like to continue to work together in such a spirit of partnership. So to end, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Fiji government, our best wishes to everyone. Thank you.